On April 30th, 2018, Celtic beat rivals Rangers 5-0 to clinch their 7th straight Scottish Premiership title. The loss meant that Rangers would stay below Aberdeen and in 3rd place, a worrying sign for one of Scotland's 2 biggest clubs. Within the next 5 days, Rangers would fire their old manager and sign a new one.
Now, Steven Gerrard has been appointed as the new manager of Rangers. The former Liverpool and England captain will take over in the summer on a 4-year deal. It's his first step into elite management, as our sports correspondent.
At the time, the move was greeted with praise and skepticism alike.
It's absolutely magic for Scottish football. It really is. It's without doubt, in my opinion, it's put Scottish football back on the map again.
He is taking an enormous risk. He wants to manage Liverpool one day. That's his aim, that's his dream. He couldn't have a harder apprenticeship than at Rangers. If he turns it round and does well, then, fantastic. But the odds are against him.
How well can he do?
Now, 2 years later, Rangers are in the last 16 of the Europa League and are a clear number 2 to Celtic. Today, we examine Steven Gerrard's 2 years as a manager.
I think the overall effect of Steven Gerrard's time at Rangers is that he's managed to really galvanise a fan base that was desperate to find a manager that they could believe in.
Stefan Bienkowski is a journalist for BBC Sports Scotland.
He's continued to improve a squad that he and the squad are desperate to ultimately challenge Celtic for a Scottish Premiership title.
And so when Steven Gerrard took over the position in May of 2018, can you give us a glimpse of what Rangers was like as a club then?
Rangers were recently returned to the top division and they were trying to find their feet not only in the Premiership, but they also had a manager in Pedro Caixinha who, despite his best intentions and despite some forward-thinking tactics and some smart moves in the transfer window, he fundamentally just didn't have enough stock among Rangers fans. And despite his best efforts, it didn't seem as though it was a project that was ever going to work. It seemed as though a project that was doomed to fail, and ultimately it did. So when Steven Gerrard arrived at Rangers, it was a club that was really hoping or looking to grasp onto something that they could really get behind. And that's kind of something he offered from day one.
And so what was kind of the state of the club, like internally, maybe at the top and just on the field, how good were Rangers? Were they the second best team in Scotland, or where did they kind of fit in the pecking order of things?
Well, the difficult thing in terms of how you kind of try to rank Rangers in Scottish football right now is that they obviously have a fan base which is arguably unrivaled, obviously aside from maybe Celtic. But in terms of the finances, they were still very much behind Celtic. They still are. And in terms of actually, at that point in time, the actual quality of their squad, despite the money that had maybe been spent, they still hadn't managed to comprehensively overcome Aberdeen for that second place spot. There was that hurdle that still had to be taken, and then from there move on to trying to do what some might consider this impossible task of matching and then overcoming a Celtic side that were full of really top class players and a club with a budget that at the time was maybe 3 or 4 times the size of Rangers. So they were by no means the size that they had been in the past, and they were a club that were really probably looking for a manager who could not maybe perform miracles, that's maybe a little too strong, but to be quite honest with you, not far off that was the kind of demands that would be put upon the next man who took over the job. And considering the manner in which Caixinha had kind of failed at that, there was some real question marks over whether the tools were in place for a manager to come in and do exactly that.
So what were his first couple weeks like in the job?
They were incredible. The best thing that comes to mind is maybe like Beatlemania. Or as if, I don't know, Brad Pitt had opened up a pub in Ashton Lane. The whole world is shining a light on Scottish football. You have to remember that 2 years ago, Steven Gerrard just simply wasn't. It wasn't as if he was a coach who had had a few jobs and fancied the role at Rangers. He really did come straight from the kind of bright studio lights of, for example, BT Sport. I'm pretty sure he was doing a Champions League game for them actually the day before he announced he was moving to Rangers.
And here tonight we've got Steven Gerrard, but he's not a Lone Ranger. We've got Rio Ferdinand and Frank Lampard.
So it was this global star, and Gerrard very much still was. I think he still is, actually. Not even just considered a famous ex-pro who's now manager. I think in many people's eyes he's still considered almost as a player celebrity to an extent. So there were certainly murmurs, or obviously rival fans questioned what he could bring to the table in terms of his actually coaching. But for the most part, there was just a huge amount of excitement that one of the genuinely biggest names in world football had decided to just kind of drop down in Glasgow and have a go at our crazy little goldfish bowl.
Quality, he's got vast experience, so as a player, so why not bring him in?
Very excited about Steven Gerrard. He's a worldwide name, and I think this will be absolutely fantastic for the club.
Absolute buzzing.
Hopefully we just have a presence. He's a captain. Rangers don't have a captain, don't have a leader. He'll get into that dressing room and they'll be scared to. Trust me, he'll go in there and do what he needs to do. Yep, brilliant.
So how did Gerrard go about remaking Rangers in his image?
I think the first thing he did, and probably the smartest thing he did, was completely disregard what came before him. There was absolutely no appetite from the fans to really keep any loyalty to the previous management team and the squad that they'd built. A huge number of players who would have been probably considered key players under the former manager, Josh Windass, Bruno Alves, Fabio Cardozo, guys like Eduardo Herrera and Carlos Peña, who had arrived at Scotland with huge question marks over their names, but had seemed to be these promised signings who never really worked out. All of these guys were either sold or loaned out immediately. And Gerrard kind of set about bringing in, probably to a large extent, proven names within British football, but also, senior players who were ready to basically hit the ground running. Connor Goldson's probably the best example of that. I know he had some issues with health issues, which is why he hadn't really continued his career in England, but he was a really smart move from Rangers. Obviously, Jamie Murphy was another one. Alan McGregor's probably a really good example, because not only was he a player who was ready to really fit into that team immediately, but he was also a player who harked back to the kind of glory days of Rangers back when they were last winning titles. And he was still an outstanding player in his own right. And of course, there's guys like Scott Arfield and Jermaine Defoe who, up until they moved to Rangers, were still doing a great job at the highest level in England as well. So almost overnight, Gerrard had decided to draw a line and to cut ties with the squads that hadn't reached the expectations that the fans had set for them last season, and decided, we're going to start from square one here, and I'm bringing my own guys in. And that's exactly what he did.
And what about his kind of tactical formation or his style on the field? Is it gegenpressing, or is it sit back and contain and then hit him on the counter? How does he play?
I think the most likely comparison to Steven Gerrard is obviously Jurgen Klopp. Gerrard, the coaching he did do before he arrived at Rangers, obviously worked within Liverpool's own coaching structure and playing for the youth teams. And he undoubtedly arrived at Ibrox with the intention of implementing a style of football and a style of tactics that would one day perhaps allow him to implement that at Liverpool. And again, it was very similar to maybe what you do see at Liverpool. He obviously didn't have the kind of players to do it to the same extent, and maybe to the exact same degree of entertainment as your Sadio Mane's and Firmino's, for example. But it was undoubtedly a 4-3-3 system with inverted wingers, a strong number 9 up front, and very attacking fullbacks. It's a tactic, and it's a style of football that Gerrard has stuck with through thick and thin, actually, at Rangers. And in my opinion, that's because, he's determined to kind of prove that it works at Rangers, and then hopefully take it on to a bigger level, or a higher level, rather, in his coaching career.
So let's go back to that kind of first season, 2018, when he's at Rangers. Their first big win was a statement win in December when they beat Celtic in the Old Firm derby.
Ibrox is bouncing. Ibrox is absolutely loving this. They've been waiting and waiting and waiting for a day like this. The day is here. The day is now. And to a man, they were absolutely colossal.
What did that win do for him and the club?
It was huge. Obviously, I'm sure most of your listeners who don't even pay much attention to Scottish football are aware of how ferocious these derbies can be, and this one was no exception, because you not only had Gerrard as this new kid in the block who had to prove himself, not only to Rangers fans, but he also had to prove that just to the wider world of football that he was ready to step up and become a coach and in a very high pressure situation. And there's very few fixtures in the whole football, in my opinion, that are higher pressure than an Old Firm derby. And he had to basically show that he could match Celtic on the pitch. He might not be able to match Celtic in the financial sheets or in the transfer market, but he had to prove that over 90 minutes they could do something to try and get near Celtic. And that's exactly what they did. They absolutely bullied and harassed Celtic that day. And I think what's probably most telling, the thing that really sticks in my mind, is that in the lead up to the goal that won the match, Ryan Kent runs to the byline, he cuts back, and in doing so, Mikael Lustig kind of slips up and falls on his backside. And
Ryan Kent looking to make it happen here. He might just do that. Ryan Kent! Deflected off down and in!
Lustig stands off him and pays the price. Kent is too skillful for him. He's too quick. And then here he doesn't just throw it over. He finds Ryan Jack. And it's a side foot finish.
What we're really looking at there is a young promising forward for Rangers, kind of skipping past this kind of former statesman of Celtic, this kind of older statesman who was undoubtedly on the cusp of, moving on from the club because he maybe past his prime. And that kind of reflected well because on the sideline you had Steven Gerrard, who's this up-and-coming manager, alongside Brendan Rodgers, who by that point the rumours had begun that he wasn't getting on with the hierarchy at Celtic and he was ultimately going to be moving on, and he ultimately did obviously move on. So the game had a huge amount of subplots towards it, and I think probably what ultimately was underlined that day was that Rangers had every intention of trying to match Celtic in the title race, and I think that's really important because up until that point Celtic fans had absolutely no belief that Rangers could get their act together and really challenge Celtic under Pedro Caixinha. I think a lot of Rangers fans felt the exact same way. But suddenly Gerrard had arrived in such a short period of time. He'd built a squad that could really challenge Celtic over the course of 90 minutes. And I think that completely changed the dynamic of Scottish football that day to an extent. You did have people suddenly saying for the first time in maybe 5 or 6 years, or maybe longer than that, look, we might actually have a title race here.
A few flashpoints today. Alfredo Morelos sent off again. Your thoughts on that?
I'll deal with that. Internally he'll be punished, and the punishment will be financial, and the financial money will go to the supporters that came here today. So I think that's only right. He's let his teammates down and the club down again, and I can't defend him anymore. I think I've gone above and beyond.
Well, that was right before the winter break of 2018, and coming back from that, one of the big subplots kind of the rest of the season was with Rangers, potentially their best player, Alfredo Morelos. He was sent off in March later that season in the next Old Firm derby against Celtic when they lost 2-1, and he was sent off for elbowing Scott Brown in that match. It was the 5th time of the season. He was red carded. Now, one was actually rescinded, but one of these subplots is that relationship between Morelos and Gerrard and his 5 red cards. What was Gerrard's response to that entire game and kind of what happened after?
He absolutely hammered Morelos, to put it bluntly. Gerrard's relationship with Alfredo Morelos is actually really fascinating to me because you have a player here who undoubtedly has a huge amount of talent, but he obviously has this one spark in him that can completely undermine everything else. And Gerrard has really tried to coach and shepherd Morelos out of this kind of unfortunate side effect of his game. And for the most part, he's done his absolute best to support him publicly. Gerrard has quite happily gone on the record after matches and defended Morelos when, there were clear yellow cards and red cards. Perhaps to the detriment of his reputation in wider football, because it's clear to everyone to see that, the sending offs were fair. But in his opinion, he's defending his player, and that's absolutely fair. If any manager in world football would do exactly that. But it did get to a point, and I think that game's a good example, when Gerrard's support for Morelos kind of butted head against his own determination and his own hopes of taking Rangers to another level. And I think that was a good example of when he said, I can only defend this guy so much before he starts detrimentally affecting my squad's ability to win titles. And I think on the most part, he's done a good job of trying to temper Morelos' more kind of ferocious aspects of his game. And it's fascinating to watch because he really has to an extent calmed down, obviously this season, 12 months later. And I think Gerrard has played a huge part in that because he's obviously got a coach there who he respects hugely, and it's something that they've had to continue to wrestle with.
Well, you mentioned how he's kind of calmed down a little bit. This year, he's only had one red card, obviously much less than last season. So what does this relationship tell you about kind of how Gerrard manages big names or big personalities or people that might rub him the wrong way potentially?
I think you could probably take a lot from the manner in which he does coach and organise his squad in terms of the way he quite publicly will not happily, but he won't hide away from berating a player. Morelos is probably the example we just used there, but he's made examples of players in the past. And I think that's probably an echo of maybe his kind of coaching style in the training ground as well. He's obviously a man who has unrivaled kind of determination to get to the very top of football as a coach, as he did as a player. And you do kind of get the sense that sometimes he struggles to appreciate or struggles to keep his frustration in check when players let him down. I think to be a player at Rangers is probably a manner in which you're completely overawed by the fact that you have this legend coaching you day in, day out, and you're probably ecstatic at the thought of learning something from him. I have no doubt that a huge number of the key players who joined Rangers in the last 2 seasons did so entirely with the intention of simply working under Gerrard. But I think the flip side of that coin is that you have a manager who can be very intimidating and very imposing, and I think he can also be very short in terms of his expectations on players.
The first 45 minutes I weren't happy, far from it. It was a poor performance, we were awful. Didn't have one player out there that was doing the shirt any justice, so I certainly weren't happy for 45 minutes. I let my feelings known very clear at half time, made some changes to the 11, and
we have seen him drop players quite unceremoniously. If they have one bad game, he has talked about players after matches to make examples of them. And I don't think that's because he's a horrible person or because he likes berating people. I think that's just a side effect of him and, the kind of personality that he clearly has and what clearly got him to the top of the game. And that's something that still kind of burns inside him as a manager as well.
Well, we know how important developing players is for managers. I mean, it's tremendously important. And, we've kind of compared him already to Klopp, but that's something that Klopp is known for. There are a number of young players, not just Morelos on Rangers. I mean, there's Shea Ojo, there's Ryan Kent, and there's others as well, Joe Aribo. How good is he at developing players?
I think he's actually quite good at developing players. I think maybe the issue comes from the fact that he's perhaps not very good at developing young players or giving young players a huge amount of time to develop. And again, that's maybe because he's a victim of his circumstances. To be the Rangers manager right now means that you have to win games every single week. And to win games every single week, that means you usually have to pick the older, more experienced players to win those games. So that's why a Jermaine Defoe at the age of 36 or 37 is so key to Rangers this season rather than perhaps a younger striker, because Gerrard knows Defoe will get them over the line. A number of players have improved drastically under Steven Gerrard. From a Scottish point of view, the most obvious ones maybe Ryan Jack, who has kind of really turned into this kind of box-to-box player and a kind of very similar style to Gerrard actually. Not by any means that I think he's as good as Gerrard was in his heyday, but he's really knocking on the door for the Scotland national team after arriving from Aberdeen. Glenn Kamara's another one as well, who was kind of sitting on the bench at Dundee and has become a crucial player in midfield as well. But what we're kind of talking about here is players in the kind of mid to late 20s. If you kind of want to talk about your Shea Ojos, and there was a Jaria the year before who was on loan from Liverpool, these guys have been kind of given bit part roles, but as soon as they kind of proved that they couldn't do it consistently, Gerrard has moved on to other players. From an English point of view, I'd probably say maybe Joe Aribo's maybe one of the one players who seems to have kind of risen to those expectations that Gerrard clearly puts on his players. And he's proven to be a very useful player in a number of positions for Gerrard. And obviously Alfredo Morelos, through thick and thin, seems to really nailed his flag to Gerrard's mast, and he continues to improve as well, despite, as we just mentioned there, the kind of personality issues that he does seem to have as well.
Just based on some of the things you've said and some of the things I've read about him, he strikes me as kind of old school. He's quite blunt and to the point, and the way you've talked about some of his interactions with players makes me believe that, he's a bit old school.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good way of describing him. He certainly comes from a period in time as a player when, if he wasn't performing as a young player, he would have obviously been replaced by someone else. And I think fundamentally, he's just a manager who is coaching at Rangers, but obviously has every intention of moving on to a higher level. He's well aware of the higher level, and therefore he puts those expectations on the players because he knows that he can't get to that next level if the players aren't able to perform that level for him. And I think that's kind of what underpins all these kind of personality traits, not just kind of coaching stats. He does hold his players to exceptionally high standards, like a lot of great coaches throughout world football. And although there might be little blips in terms of, the players coming in and out of the squad and the way they're dropped, I think you'd probably struggle to find a Rangers player who doesn't absolutely adore working underneath him because of the kind of determination and this real pressure that he puts on the squad. And I guess I agree with you. That's quite an old-fashioned way of doing it.
I want to fast forward a little bit. They finished 2018-19 in second place, so he was able to kind of break that Aberdeen second place mold. And so they go through the summer and they're in the Europa League, and they start the season winning 16 of their first 19 games and are pushing Celtic for a top spot. And on December 29th, they beat Celtic 2-1 to go just 2 points behind Celtic heading into the winter break. And today, as we speak, they are 13 points off Celtic. So what happened to them after the winter break when they were flying so high?
I think the thing that really stood out to me covering the league at that moment in time was the manner in which Rangers managed to beat Celtic and then go top of the league just before the winter break. It seemed to me as a kind of blessing in disguise for Celtic because it really ruffled their feathers and it allowed Neil Lennon to take his squad to their kind of mid-season training camp in Dubai, and he as a manager completely wiped the slate clean and said, right, we've been coasting for the most part here. Rangers have kind of underlined where our complacencies are. We need to start again. And, Celtic did do that. Lennon completely changed his formation and his system, and Celtic came back looking like this brand new, fresh side. Rangers, on the other hand, stuck with what they knew. They stuck with the same formation and system that had got them there. But the issue is that they at this kind of part of the season, you inevitably begin to pick up injuries. Rangers were getting further in the Europa League. It was having greater strain on the players. And where perhaps a more experienced manager would look to another formation or tactic or look to other players, Gerrard kind of stuck with the same tactics. I said earlier in the show, he kind of stuck to that 4-3-3 through thick and thin. Well, this is undoubtedly the kind of thin period of the season where things weren't working and there was real kind of moans and groans from Rangers fans that he wasn't shaking things up enough. Another huge aspect of that is obviously that Alfredo Morelos picked up a calf injury. Morelos, I think, only missed 2 games technically. It maybe took him about 6 or 7 weeks to get back to kind of the form that he did have. I don't think he actually even scored a goal before the season was suspended, but that was a huge part as well, because although Rangers did have Jermaine Defoe who could score goals for them and be this very useful impact sub, he wasn't a kind of powerful number 9 who led the line like Morelos, and there wasn't anyone who was able to really step in there to become that kind of match winner in terms of a goal scoring aspect like Morelos.
To start 2020, they ended up losing to Hamilton, Kilmarnock, and Hearts, all teams that are definitely not, in the top 4 or 5 in Scotland. So what explains their struggles against poor teams like that? I know injuries and tactics are one thing, but against lower teams like that, is it something more to go with, Gerrard and kind of how he sets out the team?
I guess one of the things you have to kind of appreciate if you're a player at Celtic and or at Rangers is that you have to be able to play with a kind of very defensive fortitude against bigger teams in Europe, but then sometimes you have to come back very quickly and become a very dominating side. So it's very much like asking a player to switch from, I'm trying to think of a good example, switch from like a kind of Liverpool style over-the-top dominance to a very defensive side in the Premier League who really sit back for 90 minutes and try to hit you in a counter-attack. And that's the kind of struggle that Celtic and Rangers managers have had to do for the best part of the last 20, 25 years. And I think that's kind of the thing that kind of hits Rangers more so than Celtic when they come up against these kind of, as you say, lesser sides. They have had previously against Kilmarnock when Steve Clarke was the manager. He really seemed to get his tactics spot on when Rangers came, because he realised that if you can really keep a low block, you can really stop Rangers from getting service to Morelos in the box, you can cause them a lot of problems. And that's something that teams like Hamilton, St Johnstone as well in that period of time did a really good job of, Hearts to an extent as well. And I think that's maybe the key thing there. While Rangers do have players like Ryan Kent and Aribo and Ryan Jack, and I guess Morelos to a lesser extent, who do really seem to shine actually. And I think Rangers as a whole are look far better. It's maybe the kind of weird paradox of being a Rangers fan for the last couple of years, I guess, for most of them, is that they do seem to shine against much better teams. And by that I mean, at least on paper, obviously in Old Firm derbies against Celtic and in the Europa League. But when they get asked to kind of break down these kind of teams who are happy to sit back for 90 minutes, they have struggled for the most part.
You've just mentioned how Rangers is much better against better teams, and they've gone much further in the Europa League than I think many would have expected. They're playing Bayer Leverkusen in the round of 16 right now. Is that partially also down to Gerrard performing better in these bigger games as a manager? We all know that, he was famous for coming up big as a player in big games. As a manager in some of these big Europa League matches, how has he done?
I have absolutely no doubt that Gerrard's experience as a player has been instrumental in helping Rangers players adapt to Europa League, because a lot of the players who have really starred for Rangers in the Europa League this season haven't really had a huge amount of experience playing in European competition for the most part. I mean, to make one comparison, perhaps the most kind of notorious moment of Pedro Coutinho's reign at Rangers was when they got knocked out by, I believe, a team from Luxembourg, if my memory's not mistaken me. And the kind of post-match scenes were him arguing with fans through a fence outside the kind of, in Luxembourg. And he's standing in a hedge trying to explain to fans what he tried to do. And obviously it got pictured and it got picked up by newspapers the next day, and it looked like a PR disaster. If you kind of compare that to Steven Gerrard, who always looks very cool, who always looks very calm, and I have absolutely no doubt that he could go to places like Braga and Porto in Europa League and it doesn't seem to bother him at all. That obviously feeds through to his players as well, because they do perform tremendously well in the Europa League. And to be fair as well, it's not just simply down to something like that. He does get his tactics absolutely spot on. For all that I've maybe said about Gerrard in terms of inexperience, perhaps in terms of maybe man management, he does strike me as a very, very tactically astute coach who can analyse teams and perhaps analyse better teams and figure out a way for his Rangers team to not only frustrate them, but pick up big wins. And from a Scottish point of view, the teams that they have beaten Europe this season have been tremendously impressive.
Going back to results on the pitch this year, one of their worst losses may have been their 1-0 loss to Hearts back in February in the Scottish Cup. After the match, there were doubts about Gerrard staying with the club. What happened there?
Yeah, so this is kind of another example of perhaps his inexperience as a coach kind of shining through. He did kind of make remarks post-match. He has kind of had a habit of saying things in post-match interviews when emotions are still running high, and oftentimes he can actually entirely contradict himself from one day to the next because of what he said at post-match. And this is another example when the sheer frustration of the result had a huge impact on him personally, and in the post-match interview he kind of alludes to the idea that he was kind of sick of it all.
It doesn't give a true reflection of me or my staff or our supporters. So it's very difficult to defend that performance. We got what we deserved today. We were second best from start to finish. We didn't nowhere near create enough, and we're at 6s and 7s for a lot of times, and they could have scored more goals against us. A quarter-final match with so much at stake. I'm so surprised that was the performance we were given.
A few days later, he kind of clarifies his position and he says he had no intention of leaving the club. And for the most part, I think he's absolutely. I have no reason to doubt him, but I think the real kind of takeaway from that moment is obviously, Rangers coming undone again to a lesser side who managed to set himself up the right way to kind of stop the key two or three key players. And another example of how Gerrard's inexperience as a manager kind of shines through, not only tactically in terms of not being able to come up with a plan B when these smaller teams do really stick 10 men on the line, but the way that he kind of handles that immediately afterwards, where he can, like I said, he can be quite rash in what he does say, and he usually has to talk himself back or kind of make excuses for what he said a few days later in a press conference.
If you were a big club in England, such as Liverpool or elsewhere, and you were interested in hiring Gerrard, what more would you be looking from him at Rangers?
I think Gerrard's gave a really good example of himself as a young coach at Rangers. If you're talking about a really big club like Liverpool, I think maybe the question marks they would maybe have is, does he have another 2 or 3 formations that he knows back to front in his back pocket that he would be able to kind of implement? I think also there's probably obviously a degree of, not immaturity, but like I've kind of pointed out throughout this podcast, there's a lack of inexperience in the manner in which he conducts himself in the media, the way he can almost quite publicly berate players. I'm not sure if that's something that a huge club which, for example, Liverpool or, God, I'm trying to think of another big club in England that he would move to, but I can't see him going to a club like Manchester United, for example, anytime soon. But, you know, a club... The thing about Gerrard at Rangers is that his word is final because he is such a big name, and if he does come out and criticise a player or drop a player, no one's going to question that. If he's at Liverpool and he does that with, you know, Salah or Van Dijk or something, then you do wonder whether that would fly as much. So I think, although I think he's been a fantastic tactician at Rangers, with that one formation he does stick with, I think he does have to bring more. He has to add a few more strings to his bow. If a top club are looking at him to think, can this guy solve all our problems? And I think as well, he's still got a bit of learning to do in terms of the way he conducts himself as a manager in the public.
For more Scottish football coverage, read Stefan Bienkowski's work on the BBC and 2.1. This episode was produced by John McKenzie and Hugo Chambray. I'm Josh Schneider-Weiler, and thanks for listening to Football Today. And if you enjoy this podcast, why not subscribe to our Patreon and get a raft of bonus material? Or if you can't spare the cash, why not help us out by sharing an episode with a friend? See you next time.